It started the way so many endings do, with something small. A coat, a pocket, a black velvet box the size of a clementine. Valentine's Day fell on a Wednesday that year, and I had taken the afternoon off from the community college where I taught 2 sections of introductory economics on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Not because Daniel had planned anything, he hadn't mentioned it, not once, and by year 9 of a marriage, you learn to read the silences as fluently as the words. But because I wanted to make something with my hands. I had bought salmon the day before, and a good bottle of Burgundy, and I was going to roast fingerling potatoes the way his mother had taught me before she passed, with rosemary and sea salt and a little more butter than any cardiologist would recommend. It was a Wednesday. I thought, maybe that is enough. Maybe a Wednesday with good food and the television off is what 9 years looks like, and that is not nothing. The coat was hanging on the hook by the garage door. Daniel's wool overcoat, charcoal gray, the one I had given him for Christmas 3 years ago. I noticed it because the right pocket was sitting oddly, heavier than it should be, pulling the shoulder of the coat slightly off the hook. I thought it was his phone. I reached in to pull it out so the coat would hang straight. The box was matte black, the kind that comes from a jeweler who does not need to put their name on the outside because the weight of the box says everything. I stood there for a moment with it in my palm, and I will tell you that my first thought was not suspicion. My first thought was something closer to relief. He remembered. He planned something. He went to a jeweler and spent what was clearly serious money on something for me, and he just hasn't given it to me yet because it's only 2 in the afternoon, and he's probably going to make a whole thing of it at dinner. I opened the box. The ring was extraordinary. A round, brilliant cut, at least 2 carats, set in platinum with a slim pave band. The kind of ring that exists in a different category of object than anything I had ever owned. I turned it in the light from the kitchen window and watched it split the gray February afternoon into 100 small fires. Then I looked for the card. There was no card inside the box. But there was a small white receipt tucked under the foam insert, folded twice. I unfolded it with 2 fingers, the way you might handle something you already suspect is about to change the temperature of the room. Beaumont & Lowe Fine Jewelry, Chicago, Illinois, February 13th. Total, $18,400. Payment, checking account ending in 7741. Our joint checking account, February 13th, yesterday. I put the receipt back. I closed the box. I put the box back in the pocket exactly as I had found it, and I went and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the backyard for a long time. The garden was dead and gray, the way Chicago gardens are in February. The rose bushes wrapped in burlap, the bird bath filled with ice. I had planted those roses the summer after our wedding. I looked at them for what might have been 2 minutes or might have been 15. Then I picked up my phone and called Marcus Webb. Marcus had been my attorney since before Daniel and I met. He had handled my grandfather's estate, set up the Aldercroft family trust, and kept its affairs entirely separate from my personal life, with a discretion I had always appreciated and never once had reason to test. I had not told Daniel about the trust in any detailed way. Early in our relationship, I had mentioned it in passing. There's some family money in a trust. It's managed by an attorney. Nothing I deal with day to day. And Daniel, who was not particularly curious about things that didn't directly involve him, had never asked again. It was the one large truth I had kept contained, not out of deception, but out of a bone-deep wariness I had carried since my 20s. Money changes how people look at you, and I had wanted someone who looked at me the way I actually was before any numbers entered the room. "Marcus," I said when he picked up, "I need you to pull up the Aldercroft Trust documents and tell me the current status of the Caldwell Meridian position." A pause. "Elena, it's Valentine's Day." "I know what day it is." Another pause, shorter. He knew my voice well enough to hear the thing underneath it. 34.2% as of the last quarterly statement. Nothing has changed since November. Do you want me to pull the full breakdown? Not right now, I said. But I want you on standby. I may need to make some calls tomorrow. Is everything all right? I looked at the burlap-wrapped roses. It will be, I said. Thank you, Marcus. I hung up and started making dinner. I roasted the fingerling potatoes. I opened the burgundy an hour early to let it breathe. I set the table with the good cloth napkins, the ones we only used when Daniel's colleagues came over, because I thought, if tonight is what I think it might be, I want to have done everything right. I want to be able to look back at this evening and know that I brought my full self to it, and that whatever happened next was not because I had failed to show up. Daniel texted at 6:47 p.m. Stuck in a meeting. Don't wait up. Might be late. Sorry, babe. I looked at the table. I looked at the salmon. I looked at the wine, breathing in its glass. Then I sat down, poured myself a measure, and ate dinner alone, the way I had eaten many dinners in the past year, without fully naming what that meant. Later, after I had washed the dishes and wrapped the leftover salmon in foil, I went to the coat hook. The coat was still there. The box was still in the pocket. Daniel had not come home to retrieve it, which meant he had another way to give the ring to whoever it was meant for. Or he had already given it, and the box was empty, and I had imagined everything. Or, most likely, in the way that most likely things are the ones we resist the longest. The ring was still in the box because he had not yet had his planned moment to present it. I did not open the box again. I already knew what I had seen. What I needed now was to know who. I went to bed at 10. I did not sleep. Somewhere around midnight, I heard the garage door open, and Daniel's footsteps in the kitchen, and the sound of the coat hook rattling. A pause. His footsteps moved toward the bedroom, then away. Then I heard the quiet sound of the back door opening and closing. He checked the pocket, and when he found the box still there, he put it somewhere else. I lay in the dark and listened to the furnace run, and thought about the Caldwell Meridian Group, and a CEO named Diana Caldwell, whose photo I had seen on my kitchen counter in a magazine my husband had brought home, dog-eared to her page. I thought, I have been invisible in this marriage for a long time. I had not realized until that moment that I had also been invisible in a way that could be undone. The coat hook by the garage door was empty the next morning. Daniel had left before 6, which was not unusual. Or rather, it had become usual in a way that had happened so gradually I had stopped marking it as a change. At some point in the past 2 years, the man who used to make terrible coffee and drink it standing at the counter while I was still in my robe had been replaced by a man who was gone before the alarm went off. I had told myself it was the promotion, the Director of Regional Operations title that had come through 18 months ago. Greater responsibility, longer hours, the kind of season every ambitious person goes through. I sat at the kitchen table with my own coffee and my laptop, and I looked up Caldwell Meridian Group's current corporate directory on their public website. Diana Caldwell, CEO and founder. The photo was professional and recent. She was in her early 40s, dark hair pulled back, a white shirt, the kind of direct gaze that said she had learned a long time ago not to look anywhere but straight at the camera. She was objectively striking. And the way Daniel had dog-eared that magazine page, I had assumed it was the business profile he found interesting. I had not looked closely enough at how many times he had read that particular issue before it disappeared from the counter. I called Marcus at 8:30. I need you to do 2 things, I said. First, I want to initiate the account separation process on the joint checking and joint savings. Freeze my exposure on both so that no large transactions can go through without my sign-off. Can you start that today? I can have paperwork filed by noon, Marcus said. There was no surprise in his voice, which was one of the reasons I had trusted him for 12 years. What's the second thing? I want a transaction history on the joint accounts going back 24 months. Every transfer, every large purchase, every recurring payment. Cross-reference against anything tied to Caldwell Meridian, restaurants near their office, entertainment expenses, hotel charges in the River North area. A long pause. Elena, I have to ask, do you want me to bring in a forensic accountant or keep this internal for now? Internal for now, I said. Let's see what the statements already tell us. They told us quite a lot, as it turned out, but I didn't have those results yet when Daniel came home that evening. So what I had instead was the waiting, which is its own kind of knowledge. He came home at 7:15, carrying takeout containers and wearing the expression of a man who has rehearsed an emotion and is now attempting to perform it. Contrite, that was the word for it. slightly rumpled around the edges in a way that read as endearing if you hadn't been watching it carefully for 9 years. "I'm sorry about last night," he said, setting the containers on the counter. "I know it's Valentine's Day. Was Valentine's Day. I got Thai from that place you like." I was sitting at the kitchen table with a book I had not been reading. I set it down. "Thank you," I said. He began opening containers. He talked about traffic, about a call that had run long, about a client in Milwaukee who kept moving the goalposts on a regional account. He talked in the easy, practiced way of a man filling space, and I let him fill it. I watched the back of his neck, the way his shoulders sat, the particular quality of his not looking at me while he arranged containers and found plates and poured water, like a man enacting domesticity from memory. "Daniel," I said when the containers were open and the plates were on the table and he had run out of things to arrange. "Whose ring is it?" He went very still. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds, that stillness, the brief, terrible window where a person is not yet running any particular script because they have not yet determined which script applies. Then he turned around. "What ring?" "The ring in your coat pocket yesterday, the one from Beaumont and Lowe. $18,400, charged to our joint account on February 13th. The stillness again, different this time, calculated. I could see him deciding. "Elena, I'm not asking you to explain yourself," I said, and I kept my voice even, the way you keep a cup level when you're carrying it across a floor you know is uneven. "I'm asking you to tell me who it's for. That's a simple, factual question." He sat down across from me. He put his elbows on the table and pressed his hands over his face for a moment. And when he brought them down, his expression had shifted into something I recognized from the few arguments we'd had over the years. The territory of explanation, of context. The approach of a man who believes that if he gives you enough background information, the thing he did will begin to seem like less of the thing it is. "It's complicated," he said. "It never actually is," I said. "The complications are what we use to describe it to ourselves afterward." He looked at me for a long moment. "Diana and it's not what you're imagining. It started as..." "I didn't ask how it started." "Elena." His voice shifted toward something firmer, something that had always worked before, a particular register of authority he deployed when he wanted to reset the terms of a conversation. "You need to understand that my situation at work has been incredibly difficult. The pressure of the director role, the travel, the expectation. You've been here, you've had your schedule, your classes, your routine, and I have been carrying something that I couldn't fully share at home because there was never the right moment." "You spent $18,400, I said, "from our shared account, on a ring for another woman, on Valentine's Day." He opened his mouth, then he closed it. "I'm not going to fight with you," I said. I stood up and picked up my plate. "I'm going to go finish some grating. The food smells good. Help yourself." Elena, we need to talk about this." "We did," I said. "I asked you a question. You answered it." I went upstairs, I sat at my desk, and I did not grade papers. I listened to the sounds of the house below me. Daniel eating alone, the way I had eaten alone the night before. The clink of silverware, the television coming on briefly, and then going off again. At 9:30, I heard his footsteps on the stairs, and then the particular hesitation outside the bedroom door, and then his footsteps retreating to the guest room at the end of the hall. At 10 o'clock, my phone showed a notification from my banking app. "Transaction flagged. Pending hold initiated per client instruction. The joint account, frozen." I thought about Daniel trying to access it in the morning. I thought about the face he would make, standing at whatever ATM or bank portal when the funds did not move. I did not feel satisfaction exactly. It was something quieter than satisfaction. It was the feeling of having moved one chess piece into a position it had always been meant to occupy. My phone buzzed. Not a notification, an actual call, from a number I didn't recognize. A Chicago area code, 312, not saved in my contacts. I let it ring. A minute later, a text from the same number. "This is Diana. I think we should speak privately before this gets complicated. I can explain." I stared at that text for a long time. I can explain. As though what had happened was a misunderstanding, of the kind that explanations could reach. As though a $18,400 ring charged to a joint account was a thing that could be clarified with enough of the right words arranged in the right order. I did not reply, but I took a screenshot and sent it to Marcus with a short note. She reached out. Document this. We'll talk tomorrow. In the morning, Marcus called before I had finished my first cup of coffee. His voice was its usual composed gray, but there was something underneath it, a kind of restrained intensity I had heard only once before, during a particularly complex moment in the trust's original structuring. "Elena," he said, "the statement cross-reference is done. You need to sit down." I was already sitting. "Tell me." 14 months, 214 transactions totaling just over $62,000. Restaurants, hotels, a weekend in Charleston last April that he told you was a conference in Indianapolis. The hotel was booked under his personal credit card, but the cash transfers from the joint account to cover his personal card balance are consistent and traceable. A pause. The primary restaurant cluster is within a 3-block radius of the Caldwell Meridian offices on Wacker Drive. I set down my coffee cup. $62,000. Over 14 months, yes. I thought about the past 14 months. The conference in Indianapolis. I had made him a playlist for the drive. I had bought him a new travel umbrella because he always left his somewhere. I had genuinely made him a playlist. "Marcus," I said. "She contacted me last night, directly by text. She doesn't know yet about the Aldercroft position in her company, does she?" "No," he said. "There's no public disclosure requirement at the 34% level under the trust structure as it's currently set up. She would have no way to know." Something settled in me then, like a stone finding the bottom of a deep, cold lake. Not fury, not grief, something much more precise than either of those. "I want you to draft a letter," I said, "to the Caldwell Meridian Board of Directors. Not from me personally, from Aldercroft Trust. Flagging a potential corporate governance concern regarding a conflict of interest involving one of their regional directors and a senior executive. No claims yet, just enough to trigger their fiduciary obligation to investigate." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "That will set a process in motion that can't be easily stopped." "I know," I said. "That's the point." There was a long pause, and then, "I'll have a draft to you by end of day." I hung up and sat for a while in my kitchen, in the house that had always been mine in a way Daniel had never quite understood, and I thought about a woman who had texted me at 10 o'clock at night saying, "I can explain," who did not yet know who she was actually talking to. The Caldwell Meridian Group occupied floors 38 through 43 of a building on Wacker Drive that had been renovated in 2019 and still looked like the architect was trying to prove something. Glass and steel and the kind of lobby that made you aware of your own footsteps. I had driven past it dozens of times. I had never been inside. Daniel came home from that building 5 days a week, and I had formed a picture of it in my mind the way you form a picture of any place you've never been but heard described. Assembled from fragments, probably wrong in the specific ways that matter, Marcus sent the draft letter to me at 4 in the afternoon on Thursday. I read it twice, changed 2 phrases, and sent it back. He filed it with the Caldwell Meridian Board at close of business Friday, after the weekend, so it would land in their inboxes Monday morning, when they were fresh and before Diana would have the chance to manage the information flow. The weekend was its own particular geography. Daniel made several attempts at conversation, each one approaching the subject at a slightly different angle, like a man circling a bonfire, trying to find a place that isn't hot. He tried contrition. "I never meant to hurt you." He tried context. "You have to understand what the pressure of that role is like." He tried, at one point, a version of justification that involved the phrase emotional connection, which I found so precisely inadequate that I had to leave the room to prevent myself from saying something that would have ended the conversation before it should end. On Sunday morning, he found that the joint savings account access had also been restricted. He stood in the kitchen doorway holding his phone with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not anger exactly, but the look of a man who has suddenly realized that the ground he thought he was standing on is a different kind of ground than he thought. "You can't do this," he said. "Elena, that's our money." "It's in the process of being separated," I said. "My attorney filed the motion on Friday. You'll be hearing from him directly this week." "Your attorney?" He said it the way you'd repeat a phrase in a language you didn't know you didn't speak. "Since when do you have an attorney?" "Since before we met," I said. "Sit down, Daniel. There's coffee." He did not sit down. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, and I watched something shift behind his eyes. The recalculation happening in real time. The reassessment of who exactly he had married 9 years ago and what she might be capable of that he had failed to account for. It was not a comfortable thing to watch. It was not comfortable for either of us. On Monday morning, the letter landed. Marcus called me at 9:43. The board chair, a man named Ellison Park, called my office directly. They're convening an emergency session Wednesday afternoon. He was very careful on the phone, didn't confirm any details of what the letter alleged, but the call lasted 11 minutes, and he asked twice whether the Aldercroft Trust representative would be available to attend in person. "What did you say?" I said yes. I was quiet for a moment. "Marcus, Diana Caldwell is going to find out by Tuesday at the latest that something is happening. She'll try to contain it." "She already is," he said. "Her general counsel called my office this morning, 40 minutes after Park did. They want a conversation, off the record." "No," I said. "That's what I told them." I hung up and sat at my kitchen table with my coffee going cold and thought about what the next 48 hours would require of me. Not courage. Courage is what you need when you might lose. What I needed was something more specific. The ability to be in that boardroom without letting any of the 9 years show on my face until the right moment. To be Aldercroft Trust, not Elena Voss Hartley. To walk into a building my husband had walked into 5 days a week for 3 years and sit at a table and be precisely as powerful as I had always actually been. Tuesday came with a complication I had not fully prepared for. Daniel called me at noon. "I got a call from HR," he said. His voice was different, stripped of its usual performed register, just the voice, thin and uncertain in the way a voice gets when the scaffolding comes down. "They said there's a review of my role pending, an independent compliance review." "What did you do?" "I didn't do anything to you," I said. "The board received information. They're doing their job." "Elena?" The silence on the line was dense with things he wanted to say and didn't know how to. "Diana says... She says this is going to get very complicated. For both of us." "I imagine it will," I said. "She said the person who filed the complaint, she said it might be connected to a trust with a significant stake in the company, and if that's true, that there are legal implications for the complaint itself, potential conflict of interest issues in the review process." He stopped. I could hear him breathing. "Is that you? Is the trust you?" I did not answer immediately. I let the silence do what silence does. "Elena." "I'll see you when I get home," I said, and I hung up. I spent Tuesday afternoon preparing the materials Marcus had asked me to bring to the Wednesday session. The trust instrument, the shareholder agreement, the most recent statement showing the 34.2% position, and a brief summary of the transaction history from the joint accounts. When I laid it all out on the dining room table, it covered nearly the whole surface. 9 years of a life that looked one way from the outside and another way entirely from here. From the vantage point of a woman who had never stopped paying attention to the things that mattered. Daniel came home at 6. He walked into the dining room, saw the papers, and stood very still in the doorway. "The Aldercroft Family Trust," he said. "That's what your attorney manages." "Yes." "And Caldwell Meridian. Elena, are you telling me?" He stopped. He started again. "How long have you held stock in that company?" "Since the Series B round, 8 years ago," I said. "Before it was called Caldwell Meridian. Before Diana Caldwell was your boss." He sat down. Not in a calculated way. He sat down the way a person sits when their legs have made the decision for them. He looked at the papers on the table for a long time, and I watched him reassemble the last 3 years in his head with this new fact laid over it, like a transparency placed on top of a map that changes what all the roads are called. "You never told me," he said. "You never asked what the trust actually held," I said. "You heard family money in a trust and you were satisfied." Elena, that's not fair. You spent $62,000 of our shared money on a woman you were having an affair with, I said. And this was the only moment in those 3 days when my voice came close to something that was not entirely calm. I brought it back. In 14 months. And then you bought her an $18,400 ring on Valentine's Day and put it in your coat pocket and left it hanging by our garage door. Don't talk to me about fair. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked for the first time in 9 years like a man who had run out of scripts. "The compliance review is real," I said, "and it's going to find what it finds. I would recommend you speak to your own attorney before Wednesday." I gathered the papers from the table, stacked them neatly, and went upstairs to prepare for the most important meeting of my life. I thought, as I laid out what I would wear, "It is a strange thing to have held a secret so long that it has become simply a part of the architecture of how you move through the world, so integrated that you stop thinking of it as a secret at all and started thinking of it as just a room in the house that no one else has keys to." I had not hidden the Aldercroft position out of strategy. I had not been planning for this. I had hidden it because I had been afraid, in the early years, that money would change how Daniel saw me. And later, when I had started to sense the shifts in him, because I had not yet decided what I wanted to do with what I was beginning to know, the ring had decided for me. Tomorrow, I would walk into a building on Wacker Drive and I would be someone Daniel had never fully seen, not because I had been hiding, but because he had never looked. The boardroom on the 42nd floor had floor-to-ceiling windows, and the February sky outside was the color of old nickels. I arrived 7 minutes early, which is the correct number of minutes to arrive before a meeting where you hold the most consequential cards in the room. Not first. First reads as anxious, but settled, already at the table, water poured, folder closed, hands still, when the others come in. Ellison Park arrived with 2 other board members. A woman named Renata Ghosh, who sat on 3 charitable foundations and had the careful eyes of someone used to reading rooms, and a man named Thomas Curran, who had co-founded the company's original parent entity before Diana's acquisition, and who looked, even now, like he was still quietly deciding whether he trusted how things had gone. Marcus sat to my right. Park sat at the head of the table and thanked us for coming with the practiced warmth of a man who had chaired a great many uncomfortable meetings. Then the door opened, and Diana Caldwell walked in. She was taller in person than I had expected, and the confidence she carried was the real kind. Not performed, genuinely worn, built from a decade of being right about important things more often than she was wrong. Her general counsel followed 2 steps behind. Her assistant, young and visibly tense, stopped 3 steps inside the door when Diana stopped. Diana's eyes moved across the room in the deliberate way of someone who is always tracking. Board members. Recognized. Marcus. Noted. And then they landed on me. And they stayed. She did not recognize me. But she recognized that she should. There was a fraction of a second, less than a breath, where her composure cracked along a hairline I might have missed if I hadn't been looking for it. Then she sat down across from me, and her general counsel sat beside her, and she placed her hands flat on the table with the deliberateness of someone taking physical possession of a surface. "Thank you all for meeting on short notice," Park began. "The board received a letter from the Aldercroft Family Trust earlier this week, raising concerns about a potential conflict of interest within Caldwell Meridian's regional leadership structure. The trust holds a 34.2% stake in this company, which gives them standing to request a board-level review under the terms of our shareholder agreement. Mrs. Voss Hartley is here as the designated representative of the Aldercroft Trust." Diana's general counsel wrote something on a notepad. Diana herself said nothing. She was looking at me with an expression that had gone very still, and I understood that she was still in the process of computing something. "Voss Hartley," she said. Her voice was controlled and precise. "You go by Elena?" "Yes," I said. A pause that lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Daniel's wife. Yes, I said again. And the primary representative of the trust that holds 34% of your company. Both things are true at the same time. I watched her absorb this. I watched the geometry of the last several months rearrange itself behind her eyes. The text she had sent from her personal number, the phone calls she and Daniel might have had where he described his wife. The version of me she had constructed in her mind. Quiet, uninvolved, teaching introductory economics at a community college. Not paying attention to the kinds of things that the Aldercroft Trust paid attention to. I watched her understand that she had been significantly wrong about the terms of her situation. To her credit, she did not look away. I see, she said, and her voice gave nothing. Ellison Park walked through the letter's concerns methodically. The compliance team had spent Monday and Tuesday reviewing the transaction records Marcus had provided. The pattern was clear. Daniel, as Director of Regional Operations, had held an ongoing personal relationship with the CEO, his direct superior in the reporting chain, for a period of at least 14 months. This created a textbook conflict of interest in his performance reviews, his compensation adjustments, and 2 vendor contracts he had signed off on during that period that had directed business to firms with informal ties to Diana's personal investment portfolio. We became aware, Park said carefully, that 2 of those vendor authorizations may require revisiting, as the conflict of interest potentially compromises their validity under the terms of the original contracts. Diana's general counsel started to speak. Diana put one hand flat on the table, and the general counsel stopped. "What's the board's proposed remedy?" Diana asked. Her voice was the voice of a woman who has navigated difficult rooms before, and intends to navigate this one, regardless of the new information. "Immediate suspension of Mr. Hartley from his director role pending the conclusion of the compliance review," Park said. "The review will take between 3 and 6 weeks. Depending on its findings, the outcome could range from a formal performance improvement plan to termination for cause." Diana nodded, once, as though they were discussing a quarterly budget variance. "And the vendor contracts?" "External audit. Both firms will be notified today." There was a silence. Marcus passed a document to me across the table, a single page, and I reviewed it for a moment before setting it down. It was the Trust's formal ratification of the board's proposed actions, a procedural step that would be recorded in the minutes and would carry weight in any subsequent legal challenge. "I have one additional item," I said. Every person in the room looked at me. The 14-month transaction record I provided included joint account expenditures totaling $62,000. Those expenditures were made without my knowledge or consent for personal use that did not constitute shared household expenses. I'll be pursuing full restitution as part of the divorce proceedings, but I want it documented in this record that the Trust became aware of these transactions in the course of its governance review, and that I am reserving all personal legal remedies separately from the Trust's corporate concerns. Diana's eyes stayed on me throughout. Her expression had shifted from the initial controlled shock into something harder to read. Something that was not quite respect, but was adjacent to it. The way 2 different primary colors are adjacent on a wheel without being the same. Park noted it. The minutes recorder noted it. Marcus kept his hands folded and his expression neutral, which was exactly what I had asked him to do. The meeting concluded at 4:17. Total elapsed time, 1 hour and 43 minutes. Daniel's employment was suspended effective the following morning. The vendor audits were initiated. The minutes would be filed and public to shareholders within 10 business days. As people began gathering their materials, Diana's general counsel moved toward Marcus. Diana herself did not move. She sat across the table and looked at me, and I looked back at her. "You could have stopped this months ago," she said, quietly enough that only I could hear. "If you'd told him you knew, you could have walked away quietly, and the whole thing could have been handled privately." I reached for my folder and aligned the edges against the table before I picked it up. "I walked quietly for 9 years, I said. "I got very good at it. But I'm not sure quiet was ever what I actually wanted. It was just what was easiest for everyone else." She was still looking at me. "You knew," she said. "You knew about the stake in this company the whole time he and I didn't know about you," I said. "I knew about the stake. The stake was always mine. You were the variable I didn't have until last Wednesday. Her jaw moved, slightly. Something was working behind her face that she was not going to say out loud in a boardroom. I understood that she was a person who also had things she had convinced herself were not quite the things they were. But that was her reckoning to have, not mine to manage. She didn't know my name, I said, half to myself. Then I looked directly at her. Now you do. I picked up my folder and walked to the door. Marcus fell into step beside me. In the elevator on the way down, he said nothing until the 38th floor, and then, for what it's worth, that was the best-run meeting I've been in 20 years of corporate law. The goal was not to run the meeting, I said. I know, he said. That's why it was. In the lobby, I stood for a moment on the polished floor and looked at the street through the glass doors, at the February gray outside, at the people moving past on Wacker Drive in their coats and their Tuesday afternoon errands. And I felt the specific weight of what had just happened settle into me. Not triumph. Triumph is too loud for what this was. More like the sound a door makes when it closes on a room you have decided you are finished with. My phone buzzed in my pocket. 3 calls from Daniel. I looked at them and put the phone away. The lobby doors slid open. The cold came in, clean and sharp, the way Chicago cold arrives without apology. I stepped through it. Daniel came to the house on a Saturday, 10 days after the board meeting. He called first, 3 times, and I answered the third. And I told him he could come at 2 in the afternoon, and that he should plan for a short conversation, which he probably interpreted as a sign of softening, and I meant as a sign of efficiency. He looked like he had not been sleeping well, which I noted without particular satisfaction. His coat, a different coat, not the charcoal one, that one had disappeared from the hook the week before, was slightly rumpled, and he had the quality of a person who is perpetually mid-thought, spinning through versions of what to say next and finding none of them quite adequate. I had known that quality in him before, in the early years, when he was still hungry in a way that made him vivid. Somewhere along the way, the hunger had curdled into something meaner, and the vividness had gone with it. I let him in. I did not hug him. I offered him coffee from the carafe that was already made, because I had made coffee for 2 people in this house for 9 years, and the muscle memory of it was slower to change than the understanding, and he accepted without comment. We sat at the kitchen table. He talked for a while. I let him. There was an apology in it. Not a single clean one, but the kind that accumulates gradually from the drift of a long explanation, so that by the end of it, you have received the sentiment of remorse without any individual moment where it was said plainly. He said he had lost perspective. He said the pressure of the role had isolated him in ways he hadn't recognized. He said Diana had been... And here he paused with what I recognized as a very careful selection happening. A mistake. One that he had convinced himself was something it wasn't, the way people do when they want something badly enough that wanting feels like reason. I listened to all of it. I did not interrupt. When he finished, there was a silence, and he looked at me the way a person looks when they have said everything they prepared and are now waiting to find out if it was enough. I believe you, I said, which was true in the limited way that it was true. I believe you're telling me what you understand about what happened. And I think you're right that you lost perspective. I think you started seeing me as furniture, something that holds things in place without requiring thought. And I made it easy for you to do that because I was quiet about all the things I should have said out loud. He looked up. Elena, I'm not finished, I said gently. I made it easy because I had always told myself that maintaining the peace was the same as maintaining the marriage. And those are not the same thing. I know that now. It took a black velvet box in your coat pocket to make me say it plainly, and I wish it hadn't taken that, but it did. And here we are. He started to say something. I opened the folder that had been sitting beside my coffee cup since before he arrived, and I slid it across the table. He looked down at it. The divorce filing was made last Monday, I said. Marcus sent the initial documents to your attorney. You retained one, I assume. The terms are straightforward. The house comes back to me entirely, as it was purchased before our marriage and held in my name. The joint accounts, once separated, will be divided equally on paper, but the $62,000 in demonstrated personal expenditure from those accounts will be credited against your half. You'll also see a provision for costs associated with the compliance review. Daniel, please read it with your attorney before you say anything about it, because I don't want to have that conversation here. He looked at the document for a long time without touching it. Is there anything I can say, he said finally, that would change any of this? No, I said, not cruelly, just as a fact, delivered in the same register as any other fact. He picked up the folder. He turned it over in his hands and put it back down. He looked around the kitchen, at the window above the sink that we had replaced together 2 summers ago, at the small ceramic planter on the sill where I kept rosemary year-round, at the table we had bought at a market in Andersonville on a Saturday morning in a life that felt genuinely distant now, the way a place you loved in a dream feels distant when you wake up and realize it was never real terrain. I'm sorry, Elena, he said, and this time it was plain, no architecture around it. I know, I said. Thank you for saying it that way. He left at 2:47. I watched his car pull out of the driveway from the kitchen window, and I stood there for a moment in the quiet of the house, and then I washed both coffee cups and went upstairs to finish the work I had set aside. The legal process took the better part of 4 months, which is faster than these things often go, and slower than the emotional reality of it. Marcus was meticulous. Daniel's attorney was cooperative in the way people are cooperative when the documentation is clear and the other side has demonstrated a willingness to go to circuit court if necessary. The house was straightforward. The joint accounts were straightforward. The $62,000 provision took 2 weeks of back and forth and was ultimately settled at $48,000 in Daniel's acknowledgement, which Marcus said was a reasonable outcome, given what a judge would likely award. There was one afternoon in late March, a gray Tuesday that smelled like snow that hadn't decided yet, when I drove past the building on Wacker Drive for the first time since the board meeting and found myself slowing down without quite meaning to. I had heard, through Marcus, that Diana had agreed to step back from day-to-day operations pending the independent audit's completion. The board had retained an interim CEO, a woman named Carmen Reyes, who had previously run operations at a financial services firm in Houston. Marcus had CC'd me on 2 introductory memos. Caldwell Meridian was still the company it had been. The 34% was still mine. I kept driving. My students were in the middle of a unit on game theory that semester, and I found myself thinking about it differently than I had before. Game theory, at its core, is the study of what rational actors do when they know other rational actors are making decisions simultaneously. The classic lesson is that the best outcome isn't always achieved by the player who has the most information. It's achieved by the player who uses information at the right time. Too early, and you give away the game. Too late, and the board has already moved. The timing, that is the discipline, not the information itself. I had held that information for 9 years, never intending it as a weapon. It became one only when I needed it to be. There's a version of me, I thought, that would have been ashamed of that. The woman I had been at 32, carrying the trust papers and the careful silence, and the belief that the way to be safe in a relationship was to be the person who needed the least. She would have thought, this is not who we are. We don't use things this way. But the woman at the table in that boardroom, who had put 2 cups of coffee on the table and opened the folder beside her own cup, who had let Daniel say everything he came to say and then pushed the paperwork across, that woman had learned something the other one hadn't yet. Gentleness and power are not opposites. You can be both. You are allowed to be both. The quietness was never weakness. The mistake was believing it was the only register available to me. In April, I signed the final divorce decree at Marcus's office on a Thursday afternoon. He offered to take me to lunch afterward, and I said yes, and we went to a restaurant 2 blocks away that had good soup and a window table where you could watch the street, which was showing the first tentative evidence of spring. A few stubborn crocuses in the planters outside the office building across the way, and the light doing the thing it does in April when it starts arriving at a different angle, warmer and more direct. The way a conversation changes when someone finally decides to say the true thing. I had soup, Marcus had pasta. We talked about things that had nothing to do with law or trusts or compliance reviews. He asked about my students. I told him about the game theory unit and about a student named Priya who had asked a question in class that week so precise and unexpected that I had actually stopped mid-sentence and said out loud that that was the best question I'd been asked in 3 years of teaching. Marcus laughed, a real, not a polite one, and said that sounded like the thing he had always imagined teaching would be when it was going well.
Is it?
He said. Going well? I thought about it. Yes, I said. More than I realized it was, when I had more to manage. Afterward, I walked back to my car alone and drove home. And when I pulled into the garage and cut the engine, I sat for a moment in the quiet of it. The house was mine. The trust was mine. The 34% was mine. And Carmen Reyes was running a solid ship. And Marcus had forwarded me 2 new board proposals that required my review by end of month. My students had an exam next Thursday. I was cooking dinner for my college roommate Keisha on Friday, and she was bringing her daughter, who was 8, and had recently become interested in birds. And I had found a book about Illinois birds in a used bookshop that I thought the daughter might like. And it was sitting on the kitchen counter waiting. I walked into the house and hung up my coat and looked at the empty hook beside mine where the charcoal wool overcoat had spent 3 years holding its winter weight, and I felt the absence not as grief, but as spaciousness. The way a room feels different when you've moved the heavy furniture and find there was more floor than you knew. I went to the kitchen and started dinner for 1, which has its own particular rhythm that is different from dinner for 2. Not lonelier, just different. The kind of quiet that belongs to you. He thought I was invisible. That was the part that stayed with me longest, in the months after. Not the ring, not the $62,000, not even the look on Diana Caldwell's face when she understood who was sitting across from her in that boardroom. What stayed was the simpler fact that Daniel had looked at me every day for 9 years and had not seen what was there. And I had let him not see, because I had confused the comfort of being unchallenged with the safety of being known. Invisible things can still hold everything together. A trust, a 34% stake, a quiet woman who taught economics and grew roses in burlap and made playlists for drives her husband never took. All of it was holding something the whole time. And when I was ready to let go, I let go. What's left, after you let go of something that was never going to hold you the way you deserve to be held, is not nothing. It is not nothing at all. It is just yours. Finally, simply, entirely yours.